The US has the largest and most expensive prison system in the world. Surely we have the best prison system, right? Okay, well, at least we locked up all the criminals, so the US must be safe, right? 0.7% of the US population is in prison or jail. Yet the US still has the highest crime rate among all developed countries. That's because our prisons don't decrease crime. They actually do the opposite. Violent criminals are a problem, so it'd be pretty nice if we could just lock them up until they stop being violent. But life isn't a fairy tale. Many criminals actually become even more violent after their time in prison. The US Department of Justice found that 21.8% of prisoners committed a violent crime within 3 years of being released. Why is that? You ever watch a prison fight scene in an American movie? Yeah, that's pretty much what these prisons are like. Physical fights between prisoners are extremely common in prisons, and many prison guards actually encourage violence instead of preventing it. If two inmates are stabbing each other, guards are taught to let it happen. There have been countless cases of guards allowing or encouraging fights between inmates for their own entertainment. Along with this, there are strict racial hierarchies that pressure inmates to only side with their own race, and conflicts often brew between races that lead to injury and death. Guards are also taught to use extreme physical force on inmates. Now, do you think this rehabilitates a criminal, or turns them even more violent and aggressive? When an individual spends years in an environment where they must constantly use violence and aggression to defend themselves and get what they want, they tend to carry that mentality with them after leaving. Constantly being exposed to violence can also induce PTSD symptoms after release, such as anxiety, depression, paranoia, and difficulty with emotional regulation. These symptoms make it very difficult for ex-inmates to adjust to their life after prison. But violence isn't the only traumatizing factor for these inmates. Slavery is considered bad, right? Well, not in America. The 13th Amendment still allows slavery as punishment for crime. Slavery is a very fundamental function of the American prison system, with roughly 2/3 of all inmates in state and federal prisons being forced to work. On average, these forced laborers earn between 13 to 52 cents an hour, which comes out to basically zero after tax deductions and pay-to-stay fees, as prisoners are forced to pay for their own confinement. These jobs often involve dangerous tasks, and without adequate medical care for injuries. For example, in California, many inmates are forced to fight dangerous wildfires with very minimal training. If inmates refuse to work, they are subjected to solitary confinement, where an inmate is trapped in a single cell for extended periods without human contact. In some cases, prisoners are even forced to listen to Sabrina Carpenter music. These practices can induce severe psychological harm, and 20% of US prisoners experience solitary confinement annually. So what happens when an inmate is released? Most of them are broken, traumatized, have increased aggression, and have not gained any valuable skills or knowledge to help them with their re-entry into society. This is horrible. If you take a look at any other first world country, you'll find that education is a fundamental function of their prison systems. For example, prisons in Norway offer carpentry and agricultural training. Prisons in Finland offer coding classes. Every first world country besides the US offers extensive vocational education to its inmates. Also, this is kind of off topic, but this is what a Norwegian prison cell looks like.
Oh my god! Wow!
Education programs are essential for prisoners, as many have not yet had a proper education, and unemployment is a very large reason why many commit crime in the first place. According to Brookings, incarcerated individuals participating in post-secondary education programs have 48% lower odds of returning to prison. And this explains why recidivism rates are so high in the US. Only 6% of US inmates have access to college-level education. Many states with massive prison populations, like Florida, have virtually no education system. Prisoners are also unable to subscribe to Humanity, which means they're missing out on a lot of great informational videos. When the majority of US prisoners spend all their time in mandatory labor, solitary confinement, or under pressure from violence, they have zero time to study for important skills and knowledge they need after being released. Compare this to countries like Norway and Sweden, where not only does nearly every inmate have access to education programs, but education is mandatory in these prisons. It makes sense why only 20% of Norwegian prisoners commit a crime within 3 years of being released, compared to 68% of US prisoners. Now, everything we've discussed so far makes re-entry into society extremely difficult for criminals, but we haven't even touched upon the most challenging factor, the job application process. In America, background checks pose a very large influence on the job market, with almost every employer checking for criminal records. For an individual with a criminal and prison record, it's extremely difficult to secure a job, even if it's a low-skill job, and nearly impossible to secure a well-paying office job. Even those with minor offenses like a DUI or possession of substances can be permanently disabled from finding a good job, regardless of their competence or educational background. Having a criminal and prison record also makes housing extremely difficult, as background checks are almost always involved in the apartment rental process. Homelessness is a serious and sometimes inevitable threat for those released from prison. So what happens when hundreds of thousands of people are unemployed, impoverished, traumatized, potentially homeless, and taught to be violent? You guessed it, more crime. Now the saddest part is that these inmates could have had a good life. These aren't murderers we're talking about. According to the Bureau of Justice, 95% of incarcerated Americans eventually get released from prison. Many of these inmates are incarcerated for minor offenses, and consequently have their entire lives ruined for one wrongdoing. Sure, they may have committed a mistake and need consequences, but these aren't evil people. Most individuals who commit crime are from poverty or are experiencing mental problems, which are both disadvantages they are born into. 37% of inmates have mental illness, and 57% of men and 72% of women in prison come from a background of poverty. Oftentimes, those in poverty are incarcerated because they couldn't afford to pay a fine or couldn't afford the bail, while wealthier individuals are let off the hook because they are able to afford these expenses. To put it bluntly, the justice system is punishing people for being poor. Of course, poverty and mental illness don't justify crime, but it will be unfair to claim that these individuals simply deserve a cruel prison sentence. If these individuals receive humane treatment and proper rehabilitation during their prison sentence, they can easily readjust and learn to become productive members of society. But instead, we often see people caught in a cycle of incarceration, release, and crime, because the system prevents these people from living proper lives. This is bad for everybody. It's bad for the criminals, bad for the public, bad for taxpayers, bad for the country, and bad for the economy. The only people who benefit from this are the ultra-rich leaders of the prison companies that make a profit with every individual being incarcerated. These companies are privately owned rather than the government, so they have no interest or reason to actually improve the country. Almost every characteristic of a US prison is designed for profit. Because every additional inmate brings more profit, prisons stuff their living quarters to the max, leading to overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Many prisons are understaffed because hiring less staff means maximizing profit. Coercing inmates into low-paying labor also means massive profit. Anything that doesn't align with this profit model is regarded as useless in the prison system, which is why prisons don't care to invest in important functions like education programs, mental health resources, humane conditions, and well-trained staff. Despite all this, greed wasn't the main reason why the modern US prison system was born. It was actually racism. After the 13th Amendment was passed, many southern states took advantage of a new rule, which permits slavery as punishment for crime. By incarcerating African Americans for ridiculous reasons like loitering or unemployment, they could obtain free labor, resembling the systems of slavery that existed before the Civil War. By 1898, for example, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from prison slavery, with the vast majority of convicts being black. As convict leasing faded away in the early 20th century due to cultural and economic shifts, the prison system continued to reflect racial hierarchies. Black inmates were often subjected to harsher conditions, fewer privileges, and more severe punishments than white inmates. Outside of prison, African Americans were stereotyped as violent and criminals, which led to harsher sentencing in black communities. But mass incarceration didn't truly begin until the 1970s, when President Richard Nixon began the War on Drugs campaign, with the purpose to crack down on substance use throughout the US. Despite evidence showing that substance use rates were similar throughout different racial groups, the DEA mostly targeted Black and Latino communities. Many policies were implemented that punished Black communities much harsher than white communities, despite similar substance use patterns. In 1970, the prison population was only 200,000. 30 years later, this population jumped to over 2 million. Now this is all bad, but there's actually very simple solutions that can simultaneously reduce crime and reduce prison costs. Before talking about reforming prisons, we first need to talk about how mass incarceration is a problem in itself. There seems to be this notion where the more people we send to prison, the more safe and crime-free society becomes. But the numbers don't align with this theory. Yes, crime did significantly drop from the 1970s to the 2000s, the same time that incarceration rates skyrocketed. But there hasn't always been this clear linear relationship. From 2013 to 2022, 46 states reduced prison populations while also experiencing crime declines, with Louisiana seeing a 30% prison population reduction and an 18% crime rate decrease. And there's actually a pretty simple explanation to why this occurred. Let's use violent crime as an example. For every violent crime that is committed, roughly 4.6% of the perpetrators are actually incarcerated due to many factors that are largely out of law enforcement's control. And this applies to all crime, not just violent ones. Because so few instances of crime lead to arrest and conviction, and most cases go under the radar, maintaining a high incarceration rate can only do so much to reduce the crime rate. The only real and effective solution is to focus on crime prevention rather than punishment. Higher wages, higher employment, higher police presence, and improving law enforcement have been proven time after time to reduce crime. And these changes are largely responsible for the drop in crime we've seen over the last few decades. It will be much more practical to allocate funding towards these areas of society rather than prisons. And even for individuals arrested and convicted for crime, incarceration oftentimes does not fix anything. For example, incarcerating those who sell substances has very little impact, as this role can be easily replaced within a community. For substance possession crimes, treatment and rehab is far more effective than incarceration, and will lead to much safer and healthier communities. In 2019, Kentucky attempted to address its substance use-related issues by spending $402 million on local jails rather than treatment, employment, and housing. The following year, Kentucky had the third highest overdose fatality rate in the US. Building systems upon punishment rather than prevention and treatment simply leads to disaster. The same applies to crime caused by mental health. As it turns out, mental health resources are far more effective in preventing crime than punishment. A study found that 61% of people in Los Angeles jails taking psychotropic medications could be safely diverted to community-based alternatives like supportive housing and clinical support, which are much more effective and humane. Not only that, but these alternatives are significantly cheaper, as jails and prisons have much more complicated expenses to deal with. In Los Angeles, community-based housing and clinical care for individuals with serious mental health needs costs $180 per day, versus $445 to $650 per day for jail. Mass incarceration needs to change, but now let's talk about the changes that need to happen within prisons. First, long-term sentencing needs to be used more carefully, and those who haven't committed unforgivable atrocities should not be given excessive sentences. There seems to be this mentality in the US justice system that the harsher the punishment is, the less likely an individual is to reoffend. But at what point is too much? Research shows that recidivism rates drop significantly after 6 to 10 years in prison, and any sentence longer than that has very little effect on how likely they are to reoffend. Let's say a parent is punishing a child for misbehavior. A certain degree of punishment will be effective in preventing misbehavior, but when punishment is excessive, it doesn't make the child even more well-behaved. In some cases, it does the opposite, making them bitter, angry, and rebellious. The same applies to criminals. When we give prisoners excessively long prison sentences, we only worsen their mental problems and waste our taxpayer money on their confinement. Along with this, research proves that people are in their criminal peaks in their late teens and 20s, and that their criminal tendencies decrease significantly after this period. However, many individuals are serving sentences long after they pass this age period in their lives, meaning they're serving unnecessarily long sentences. Long-term sentencing is harmful, useless, and expensive. Again, I'm not talking about those with unforgivable felonies. Anyone who commits any of these crimes should be locked up forever. I'm talking about the majority of inmates who still deserve a second chance in life. Next, we need to adopt similar education programs in our prisons like those in other first world countries. This involves secondary education to inmates who never finish high school, college-level education, and vocational training to prepare inmates for the workforce. And these programs can't be optional. Every uneducated prisoner must be forced to partake in these programs. I've already discussed why this is crucial earlier, but just how much will these reforms actually cost? Well, on average, it costs $60,000 a year to house a prisoner, and $5,000 a year to provide higher education to one prisoner. Now, if you take into account how higher education drastically decreased recidivism, the amount of money we could be saving by implementing higher education is substantial. According to a study by Rand Corporation, every dollar spent on prison-based education saves taxpayers $5 in future incarceration costs, as educated inmates are less likely to reoffend. This is a no-brainer. By implementing education programs in our prisons, we make society safer, improve the lives of millions, improve our employment rate, and save money while doing so. Finally, the profit system that drives the prison industry must be put in check. There needs to be strict regulations that prevent prisons from neglecting prisoners for the sake of profit. Forced labor should be only used for inmates serving life sentences, or be used as punishment for misbehavior, rather than a requirement for the majority of inmates. Overcrowding and understaffing is a big problem in these prisons, and there needs to be rules set in place that require a certain staff-to-inmate ratio. Guards must also receive extensive training before they can begin their work, the same way any other law enforcement or public service job does. They need to be trained to de-escalate violence and intervene in physical fights. This is essential to create a safe prison environment which rehabilitates criminals rather than escalating their criminal behavior.
American prisons are violent, but you know what else is violent? Me. I'm about to turn violent if you don't like and subscribe right now. Oh yeah, also I made a video about how American schools turn children violent and stupid. So you should probably watch that video. It's a good video if you haven't seen it yet. Watch it right here. My life has been pretty stressful lately, pretty hectic. So I don't have as much time to work on videos as I did in the past. But once this period passes, I will have a lot more time to work on videos for you guys. So stay tuned. I have a lot more great content coming for you guys, and I'll use all my free time to make videos for you guys. So bye bye.